I came home from my parents and saw that something was wrong in the house, and when I went into my wife's room, I saw that a man in a prisoner's uniform was on top of her, and the woman was having fun. I will start all over again. I never imagined myself as the kind of man who'd come home to find his life unraveling right before his eyes. My name is Mark Reynolds. I'm 37, and up until now, I thought my life was steady, predictable. I was born and raised in this town and never wanted much else. Met my wife, Lisa, here. She was my high school sweetheart, the girl I could always count on. We had what you'd call a good life. Nothing extravagant, just solid. My parents lived just a couple of hours away, in the next town over. I go out there every month or so, check on them, make sure they're all right. That weekend was no different. My dad had just had some minor surgery, and I wanted to be there to help him settle back in. So, on Friday morning, I packed a bag, kissed Lisa goodbye, and told her I'd be back Sunday afternoon. She barely looked up from her coffee, muttering a quick, "Drive safe." Nothing out of the ordinary. Or so I thought. When I got back on Sunday afternoon, I remember feeling a strange tightness in my gut as I pulled into the driveway. It was one of those eerie moments where you don't know why you're uneasy, you just are. Our living room blinds were half closed, something Lisa never does. She loves natural light, the kind that brightens up every corner of our home. I shook it off, chalking it up to her forgetting or something. I unlocked the door, my mind already on dropping my bag and lying down after a long weekend. But when I stepped inside, everything froze. The smell hit me first, sweat mixed with something heavier, a metallic scent that made my skin crawl. I remember calling out her name, Lisa. My voice sounded hollow, hanging in the still air of the house. I waited, but there was no response. I walked towards the kitchen, and that's when I heard the faint sounds coming from upstairs. Footsteps. My stomach twisted as I headed up. Step by step, I moved towards our bedroom door, already slightly ajar. I pushed it open, and that's when I saw them, Lisa and a man. But he wasn't just any man. He was built like someone who hadn't spent a day outside a prison gym, with the kind of tattoos that weren't done in any neighborhood parlor. His eyes were wild, darting between me and Lisa, who looked just as shocked as I was. I felt something inside me snap. My vision blurred, and all I could see was them. The betrayal, the sheer disbelief. It was like watching myself in a scene that wasn't mine. I didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even blink. Then he started to laugh, low and menacing, as if my shock was some kind of joke. He didn't even try to cover himself. That smirk, like he owned my house, my wife, my whole damn life. God, I'll never forget it. Lisa scrambled to her feet, grabbing the sheet and wrapping it around herself. "Mark, please," she stammered, her voice shaking. "It's not what it looks like." I almost laughed at that. Not what it looks like. A strange man in my bed, the smell of them still hanging in the air, and she says it's not what it looks like? I didn't even know how to respond. I just stared, trying to piece together how we'd ended up here. Who the hell is this? I finally managed, my voice sounding foreign, like it was coming from someone else. The man's smirk widened. "Name's Alex," he said, stretching out his hand as if this was some casual introduction. "When I didn't move," he shrugged. "Just got out of prison. Thought I'd pay your wife a little visit." I wanted to punch him, to wipe that grin off his face, but something stopped me. A small voice in the back of my mind reminding me that this guy had been in prison. Who knew what he was capable of? Lisa stepped between us, looking at me with pleading eyes. "Mark, please," she said, her voice choked. "I can explain." "Explain?" I snapped, barely keeping my rage in check. "You invite some convict into our home, into our bed, and now you want to explain?" "It's not like that," she cried, desperation etched across her face. I didn't plan this." The anger in me simmered, twisting into something darker. I took a step back, the realization crashing down. "How long, Lisa? How long has this been going on?" She opened her mouth, then closed it, looking away as if the answer was too painful to speak. That silence told me everything. My world, the life we'd built together, was crumbling in front of me. Finally, she whispered, "We met a year ago. He reached out to me." Reached out? My voice was rising now. You mean to tell me he's been locked up for 5 years, and the first person he thinks of when he's out is you? Her shoulders sagged, and she wouldn't look at me. I could see the shame written all over her face, but it didn't make a damn bit of difference. Mark, I'm sorry, she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. I was lonely. You're always working, always gone, and I just needed someone. My fists clenched, a burning fury I could barely contain. So you turned to a convict? Someone who doesn't belong in society, let alone in our home. Lisa flinched as if I'd slapped her, and for a moment, I almost felt guilty. Almost. But the man, Alex, he just leaned back, watching the scene unfold as if he was above it all, as if he was the one in control. And maybe he was. A million thoughts ran through my mind. The possibility that he'd been using her, that she'd fallen for some sob story. But as I stood there, I could feel something else creeping in. Fear. Fear that this wasn't over, that he wasn't just going to walk away and let us piece together what was left of our marriage. Mark, Lisa began, her voice breaking. He's dangerous. He's on the run. They're looking for him. For a moment, Tom stopped. The weight of her words sank in. This man wasn't just some fling. He was a wanted criminal, a fugitive who'd somehow found his way into my home, my life, and my wife. And as I looked at him, that smirk still playing on his lips, I realized with a sinking feeling that this was just the beginning. I stood there, reeling, struggling to process the whirlwind of betrayal, fear, and anger choking me. Here was this man, Alex, lounging in my own home, in my own bedroom, while my wife clung to a sheet, terrified. A dangerous man, she'd said, on the run. What the hell had she gotten us into? A sick feeling settled in my gut as I looked from Lisa to him. For a split second, I considered my options. It was one thing to confront your wife's lover. It was another thing entirely when that lover happened to be a fugitive, unpredictable, and unhinged. And yet, I couldn't just walk away. This was my home, my life. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to keep calm. Lisa, I said quietly, though the rage boiled under my skin, I think you need to explain, fully, now. She looked at Alex as if she needed his permission to speak. He gave a small nod, a smug look that made my stomach turn. She took a shaky breath, her voice barely a whisper as she started. It started with letters, she said, looking anywhere but at me. A friend of mine, Sophie, she volunteers at the prison. She mentioned that some of the guys there needed someone to talk to, someone who could write to them. My eyes narrowed. And you thought you'd be that someone? I just wanted to help, she stammered. You were always so busy with work, and I thought maybe it would. I don't know, fill a void, just something to distract me. Distract you? I repeated, my tone laced with disbelief, but she nodded, looking down at her feet. Alex wrote back. At first, it was harmless, talking about his life, how he'd gotten there. And yes, he's made mistakes, but he's been through so much. And I felt sorry for him. He wasn't the monster people thought he was. Oh, so he's misunderstood? I said, almost laughing at the absurdity. The guy's in prison for God knows what, and you thought you'd just write him little love letters and bring him home? It wasn't love letters, she shot back, eyes wide, almost pleading. But yes, we got close. We connected. I don't know how it happened, but when he got out, he came here. I thought it would just be one time, a goodbye, that's all. A goodbye. Alex snickered from across the room. Yeah, that's what you told yourself. The way he looked at her. It was as if he owned her, like he'd gotten inside her head, her heart. I knew then that whatever they'd shared, it had gone beyond some fleeting thrill. He had a hold on her, a grip she couldn't shake. I could barely stand to look at her, the woman I'd trusted, the woman I'd built a life with, who'd brought this stranger into our home. Do you even know what he's done, Lisa? Why he was locked up? She hesitated, and I knew in that pause that she didn't. It doesn't matter, she finally murmured, glancing at him. Whatever it was, he's different now. He told me he was trying to change. Trying to change, I repeated coldly, unable to believe the words coming out of her mouth. You think that means anything? Alex just grinned, the kind of smile that could curdle blood. I don't need you telling her what I am or what I'm not, he said, his voice dripping with contempt. Lisa knows what I'm capable of. Don't you, baby? A chill ran through me. There was no way he was leaving, not without a fight. The realization settled heavy and dark in my gut. I needed to get him out of here, but not without knowing exactly what this was. Lisa, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. What's his plan? Are you actually planning to leave with him? She froze, looking away, and I felt my heart stop. A quiet tear rolled down her cheek. He doesn't have anywhere to go, Mark, she whispered. They're after him. I can't just leave him out there. My fists clenched, my pulse thundering in my ears. So, what? You're going to harbor a fugitive in our home? She looked at Alex, searching his face, her voice barely audible. We'll go somewhere safe, away from here, where no one knows him. And then he can start fresh. That's your grand plan? I spat, my voice shaking with anger. Throw away everything we've built for this guy? And then what? You think he's just going to change, magically become a different person? Alex stood up then, towering over me, his eyes dark with anger. I don't need some lecture from you. Lisa made her choice. She sees something in me that you could never understand. I've done things, sure, but she gets it. She's not some judgmental prick like you. My heart hammered, and for a split second, I wondered if this was the end, if he'd take one step forward and attack. But he didn't. He just watched me, that smug look never leaving his face. Lisa, I said, forcing my voice to stay calm, you need to think about this. Really think about it. This isn't just some game. But she didn't respond. Instead, she reached out, grabbing Alex's hand. I felt the air leave my lungs as I realized what that meant. This wasn't a mistake or a fling. She'd made her choice, and it wasn't me. I don't know how long I stood there, stunned, watching the life I knew shatter before my eyes. My mind raced, desperate for a way to make her see reason, to pull her back, but the truth was searing, undeniable. She was gone. Finally, I swallowed, choking back the bitterness. Fine. If that's what you want, go. Just go. But then something shifted. Alex's grin turned darker, more menacing. Oh, don't worry, Mark. We'll go. Just one thing, though. He stepped closer, and I could smell the stale scent of prison on him, a cold reminder of what he was. We'll need your car. I laughed bitterly. You're kidding, right? He didn't laugh. He just looked at me, his eyes dead and unblinking. I'm not asking. Lisa's hand shook as she reached for my arm. Please, Mark. It'll just be for now, until we can get somewhere safe. Please, just let us go. The absurdity of it hit me, and a hollow laugh escaped before I could stop it. You think you're going to ride off into the sunset, Lisa? Like some fairy tale? Alex's expression hardened. Hand over the keys, or this gets ugly. I glanced at Lisa, hoping, desperately, that she'd see what a mistake she was making. But all I saw was resolve, a mix of fear and devotion that cut deeper than any words could. Slowly, I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing against the familiar weight of my car keys. I pulled them out, holding them in my hand as I looked into her eyes one last time. Here, I said, my voice hollow. Take them. Take it all. She took the keys from me, her hand trembling. I watched as they turned, heading for the door, my stomach churning with dread and disbelief. But before they reached the hallway, Alex paused, turning back with that chilling smile. Thanks for the ride, Mark, he sneered. Oh, and don't worry. I'll take good care of her. They left, the front door slamming shut, and I stood there, paralyzed in the empty house that was no longer a home. Every instinct screamed to go after them, to pull her back, to save her from the disaster she was running toward. But I knew it was no use. She was gone, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I sank onto the couch, the silence around me suffocating. And as I sat there, surrounded by the remnants of a life I thought was real, a terrible resolve began to take shape. If Lisa wanted this life, if she'd chosen him over me, then she could have it. But I'd make sure she understood what she was giving up. And as for Alex, he wouldn't get away that easily. I had no idea what I'd do next, but one thing was certain. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The house was a tomb after they left. Silence pressed in from every corner, filling the gaps where our laughter, our plans, and the everyday noise of life had once been. I tried to distract myself, straightened the cushions on the couch, picked up her coffee cup from the morning, anything to keep my mind from drifting to what she was doing, who she was with. But it was pointless. The life I knew, the woman I'd loved, they were gone. She'd walked out that door, hand in hand with a man I could barely believe she'd brought into our lives. And she'd done it with a determination that left me cold. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch, staring at the door, feeling something fester inside me. I wanted to get mad, to scream or punch a wall, to do something to shake this suffocating numbness. But instead, I felt only a heavy emptiness, the weight of a life shattered, drifting around me like dust. The next morning, I knew what I had to do. If they thought they could just disappear, they were wrong. I wasn't going to let her just walk away like this. If she wanted a fresh start with him, she'd do it knowing the cost. I started making calls. First, I called the sheriff's department. I gave them every detail I knew about Alex, the tattoos, his build, even the way he looked at her. The officer on the other end listened, but I could hear the boredom creeping into his voice. An escaped convict? A man who'd seduced my wife? I could feel the skepticism oozing through the line. Still, he agreed to file a report. But as he ran Alex's description, his tone shifted, a hint of recognition in his voice. Wait, you said he had a tattoo on his right arm? A snake wrapped around a dagger? Yeah, I said, surprised he'd picked up on such a specific detail. Why? The officer cleared his throat, his voice dropping low. We've been looking for this guy, Alex Torres, convicted for armed robbery, assault, and a list of other things a mile long. Escaped during a transfer to another facility about a month ago. He's dangerous, Mr. Reynolds. You're sure he was with your wife? I felt a sick satisfaction hearing that. Dangerous. Yeah, she'd really picked a winner. I'm sure. She left with him last night, took my car. We'll issue an alert and get your vehicle in the system. If he's in the area, we'll find him, the officer said, his tone now all business. In the meantime, keep your doors locked. Don't approach him if he returns. I hung up, feeling a flicker of hope. Maybe they'd catch him before he dragged her any deeper into this mess. Maybe, by some miracle, she'd come back. I went to work that Monday, but my focus was shot. My boss, Fred, pulled me aside halfway through the day, his gaze sympathetic. Mark, you're not yourself. Why don't you take the week off? Clear your head. Come back when you're ready. I wanted to tell him everything, to pour out the twisted mess of betrayal, fear, and anger festering inside me. But instead, I just nodded, thanked him, and went home. 3 days later, I got the call. Mr. Reynolds? It was the sheriff's department. I recognized the voice of the same officer I'd spoken to before. Yeah, that's me. We found your car, he said, his tone grave. It was abandoned just outside of town, near the old quarry. It looks like they'd been there a while before they left. We didn't find any sign of them, but we're running checks in nearby towns. My hands went cold, and I sat down, bracing myself. And, did you find anything else? The officer hesitated. Nothing that indicates foul play. We're keeping an eye on neighboring areas, but there's no guarantee they're still close. If they're moving quickly, they could be halfway across the country by now. I wanted to ask what kind of lead that was supposed to be, but I swallowed the anger. They were doing what they could, and I knew it. Thanks for letting me know, I said, my voice hollow. Days blurred into each other after that. I drive around town, looking in the places we used to go together, wondering if she'd show up or call. But I never heard from her. Each morning, I woke up hoping I'd find her sitting on the couch, remorseful, telling me she'd made a huge mistake. But I'd only ever find an empty house, the quiet mocking me. About a week later, I got a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't pick up, thinking it was probably another telemarketer or some scam. But a part of me couldn't help hoping, so I answered. Hello? A faint crackle, and then her voice. Mark. The sound of her voice after so many days of silence was like a punch to the gut. I could barely breathe. Lisa? Where are you? Are you all right? I can't tell you where I am, she said, her voice trembling. I wanted you to know I'm okay. He's fine. We're fine. We found a place to stay for a while. Lisa, what the hell are you doing? I blurted out, my voice filled with frustration. You've run off with a convict. The cops are after him. You know that, right? She was quiet, and for a moment, I thought she'd hung up. But then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I know, Mark. I thought I could help him. He promised things would be different. Different? Lisa, he's a criminal. He doesn't change just because you want him to. She sniffed, and I heard the faint sound of her crying. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I didn't know how dangerous he was. Then come home, I said, trying to keep the desperation from my voice. Please, Lisa, come back, and we'll sort this out. We'll find a way to make things right. Another silence, and then a deep sigh. Mark, I can't. Not now. He needs me. He doesn't have anyone else. It felt like she'd twisted a knife in my chest. So that's it? You're throwing away everything we built together. All because he needs you? What about me, Lisa? Don't I deserve some kind of explanation? There was a long pause, and for a second, I thought maybe I'd gotten through to her. But when she spoke again, her voice was distant, resigned. I'm sorry, Mark. I just needed you to know I'm okay. I'm sorry for everything. And then she hung up. I sat there, staring at the phone, the dial tone buzzing in my ear like a taunt. She was gone, really gone, and she'd chosen him. There was no more hoping, no more clinging to the idea that she might come back. That night, the dream started. I'd see her and Alex, always just out of reach, running away together. In the dream, I was powerless, forced to watch as she disappeared, laughing, into the distance. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, the room cold and empty, her absence hitting me like a blow each time. 2 weeks passed, and then, just as I'd begun to think I'd never see her again, she returned. I was at home, on the couch, mindlessly watching the local news. I heard the soft knock on the door, hesitant, barely a sound. I opened it, and there she was, disheveled, her hair a tangled mess, her face gaunt. She looked up at me, eyes hollow, as if the weight of the last few weeks had drained every ounce of life from her. Mark, she whispered, her voice broken. For a moment, I just stared at her, too stunned to speak. Part of me wanted to pull her inside, to wrap her in my arms and pretend none of this had happened. But the anger simmering beneath my shock wouldn't let me. What are you doing here? I asked, my tone colder than I intended. She flinched, wrapping her arms around herself. I don't know where else to go. A bitter laugh escaped before I could stop it. So what? He finally get tired of you? Decide you weren't worth the risk? Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she shook her head, a desperate, frantic motion. He's dead, Mark. Alex is dead. The words hit me like a sledgehammer, and I struggled to process what she was saying. What? How? We were staying in a cheap motel, a few towns over, she said, her voice barely audible. We'd been hiding out there for a few days. And then, he started talking about leaving, about getting more money, stealing a car. I tried to talk him out of it, but he wouldn't listen. She choked on a sob, and I felt the anger slip away, replaced by a strange numbness. The police found us, she continued. Someone must have seen him or recognized him. He ran, and they shot him. I felt nothing. No relief, no satisfaction. Just a strange, hollow emptiness. So now what, Lisa? You thought you'd come back here, pick up where we left off? She looked up, eyes wide, pleading. I don't know. I just didn't know where else to go. Mark, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I let out a slow, bitter sigh, turning away from her. I'd spent the last few weeks hating her, mourning her, trying to understand how the woman I'd loved could throw everything away for someone like him. And now here she was, broken and lost, with nowhere else to turn. Lisa, I said quietly, I don't know if sorry's enough anymore. She sobbed. and for the first time, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't allowed myself to feel since she left. Pity. She'd made her choice, and she'd paid the price. But I couldn't just pretend everything was okay. Not after everything she'd done. As I looked at her, I felt the weight of a decision settle heavy in my chest. Whether I could forgive her, whether we could ever go back, was something I'd have to face. But I knew one thing for certain. We could never be the same. And maybe, in some twisted way, that was the only justice I'd ever get. The days that followed Lisa's return were an exhausting blur of quiet resentment, awkward silences, and conversations that went nowhere. Each day she stayed in the house felt like a new wound opening up, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could take it. She slept in the guest room down the hall. We barely spoke, the weight of what had happened too heavy to break through with words. She'd start to speak sometimes, but I'd stop her with a look, unable to hear whatever explanations or apologies she thought would somehow make this right. In my mind, I replayed her betrayal over and over again. I'd remember the way she'd looked at him that night, the way she'd held his hand as they walked out, as if she'd known him all her life. I couldn't shake the image of that smirk on Alex's face, the smug look that told me he'd won. But he hadn't. Not really. He was gone now, and I was left to pick up the pieces of the life he'd shattered. One night, a couple of weeks after she'd come back, Lisa knocked softly on my bedroom door. I was lying on my back, staring at the ceiling, as I had been for hours. I didn't want to see her, but I sat up anyway, bracing myself for whatever she had to say. She entered, her face pale and drawn, as if she hadn't slept in days. She sat down at the edge of the bed, her hands twisting in her lap, and after a long silence, she looked up, her eyes searching mine. "I know I can never fix what I've done, Mark," she whispered, her voice thick with regret, "but I have to try. Please, just let me try." I wanted to scream, to tell her that she'd done enough damage, that I didn't want her here. But when I opened my mouth, the words didn't come. I just stared at her, the weight of everything pressing down on me. "What do you want me to say, Lisa?" I finally managed. "That it's okay? That I forgive you? I don't even know if I can." Her shoulders slumped, and she nodded, as if she'd expected that answer. "I know," she whispered, "but I can't just leave. I don't know where else to go." "You should have thought about that before," I snapped, the anger slipping out before I could stop it. "You should have thought about that before you let him into our home, our lives. You let him destroy everything." She flinched, tears welling up in her eyes, and for a moment, I almost felt guilty. Almost. "I'm sorry, Mark," she said, her voice breaking. "I never meant to hurt you. I was lost, and he offered me something I thought I needed. But I was wrong. I see that now. Only because he's dead," I muttered, unable to keep the bitterness out of my voice. She looked down, the silence stretching between us, thick with unspoken words. After a moment, she stood up, heading for the door. But before she left, she turned back, her face streaked with tears. "I'll keep trying, Mark," she said softly. "Even if you can't forgive me, I'll keep trying to make this right." After she left, I lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling once more. But her words echoed in my mind, gnawing at me. Could she ever make this right? Could we? Days turned into weeks, and somehow, we settled into a fragile routine. I'd go to work, come home, and find her cleaning or cooking, like some desperate attempt at redemption. She'd hover, waiting to see if I needed anything, like she could somehow erase the past if she was helpful enough. But it didn't change anything. The gulf between us was too wide, too raw. One evening, I got a call from the sheriff. He wanted to meet, said there were updates on the Alex Torres case. Lisa looked up from the kitchen when I told her I was going out. She didn't ask where. I think she knew. The sheriff's office was dimly lit, quiet except for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. I waited in a small room, tapping my fingers on the cold metal table, wondering what they could possibly need from me now. Finally, the door opened, and Sheriff Hardy stepped in, a grave look on his face. He took a seat across from me, setting a thick file on the table between us. "Mark," he said, his tone serious, "there are a few things you should know about Alex Torres. Things we didn't discuss before." I frowned, leaning forward. Go on. Hardy opened the file, flipping through the pages until he found what he was looking for. Alex Torres had a history, not just of the crimes he committed, but of the way he manipulated people. He'd done it before, twice, actually, both times with women who'd reached out to him while he was serving time. I stared at him, the weight of his words settling over me like a lead blanket. Are you saying Lisa wasn't the first? He nodded grimly. No. He developed relationships with other women, women who thought they were helping him, redeeming him. They believed his promises, trusted him, and every time, he'd find a way to use them. He was clever, manipulative. He had a knack for making people feel needed, for making them believe they were the only ones who could save him. A sick feeling churned in my stomach. Lisa had been one of his targets, his tools, and she'd fallen for it, hook, line, and sinker. The sheriff continued. When we finally caught up to him, he'd been planning another robbery, something big. He wasn't just on the run. He was gearing up for another score, and from the looks of it, he'd convinced Lisa to help him. My hands clenched into fists, a fresh wave of anger surging through me. She'd been ready to help him, to risk everything. For a man who'd manipulated her, used her, just like he'd done to others. I just thought you should know, Mark, the sheriff said quietly. Sometimes, people get swept up in things they don't understand. Alex Torres was good at making people believe they needed him, that he was something he wasn't. I nodded, barely hearing him. My mind was reeling, trying to process everything he'd said. Lisa hadn't just betrayed me. She'd been deceived, twisted into believing that Alex was someone he wasn't. But in the end, she'd made her choice. When I got home that night, Lisa was sitting on the couch, waiting. She looked up as I walked in, her eyes full of questions. But I didn't say anything. I just went to bed, the weight of the sheriff's words pressing down on me. 2 days later, Lisa finally broke down. It was late, well past midnight, and I was lying in bed when I heard her footsteps in the hallway. She knocked softly, and before I could say anything, she entered, her face pale, eyes red and swollen. "Mark, please," she whispered, her voice choked with desperation. "I need to talk to you." I sighed, sitting up, though I could barely look at her. "What is it, Lisa?" She took a shaky breath, her hands wringing together as she struggled to find the words. "I was wrong, Mark. I know that now. I was so lost, and he made me feel like I mattered, like I was doing something good. I thought I was helping him, but I see now that he was using me." Her voice broke, and she buried her face in her hands, sobbing. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even know if I can forgive myself, but I can't keep living like this, knowing that I destroyed everything we had. I'll leave if you want. I'll do whatever it takes to make things right." I stared at her, the anger simmering in me mixing with something else, something I couldn't quite name. I didn't know if I could forgive her, if I could ever look at her without seeing him, without feeling the sharp sting of betrayal. But as I watched her break down, I felt a small crack in the wall I'd built up. "Lisa," I said quietly, my voice rough, "I don't know what's left for us. I don't know if I can ever trust you again." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I understand. I needed you to know that I'm sorry. Truly." The words hung heavy between us, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. I could feel her pain, her regret, and maybe, just maybe, I felt a sliver of pity. I didn't know if that was enough to rebuild what had been lost, but for now, it was all I had. "Go to bed, Lisa," I said softly, my voice barely a whisper. "We'll figure this out in the morning." She nodded, a faint glimmer of hope in her eyes, and left the room. As I lay back, the weight of everything pressing down on me, I closed my eyes, wondering if forgiveness was possible, or if some wounds were simply too deep to heal. The next morning, I woke with a dull ache behind my eyes, a heavy reminder of the night before. Lisa was in the kitchen, her back to me as she prepared breakfast. She moved quietly, almost hesitantly, as if she were afraid to disturb the silence that had settled between us. I sat at the table, waiting as she placed a cup of coffee in front of me. She poured one for herself and sat across from me, her hands wrapped around the mug, looking everywhere but at me. "Mark," she began, her voice barely audible. "I don't know if you'll ever trust me again, but I know I have to earn the chance, even if it's just a sliver. I'd do anything to make this right, anything to make up for what I've done." I stared at her, the weight of everything she'd said the night before still pressing on me. I wanted to lash out, to let the anger I'd buried rise up and consume her, to make her feel the pain she'd caused. But when I looked into her eyes, I saw something broken, something beyond my reach. Whatever she'd felt for Alex, whatever she believed about him, was gone now. She'd been shattered by it, and I could see that clearly. "Lisa," I finally said, my voice cold, "you've destroyed everything we built together. You made your choice, and now we both have to live with it." She flinched, her eyes filling with tears. But she didn't look away. "I know," she whispered, "and if that means I have to leave, I will. But if there's any chance you can find it in yourself to let me stay, I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make this up to you." The silence that followed was thick, each word she'd spoken hanging in the air like a weight neither of us could carry. I didn't know if forgiveness was possible, didn't know if I could ever look at her and not see him, not feel the anger that boiled beneath the surface. But I knew that if I told her to leave, if I ended it here, I'd be left with that anger forever. It would fester, consuming whatever life I tried to build from here. "We'll try," I said finally, the words surprising even me. "But if you stay, Lisa, things won't just go back to the way they were. There are no guarantees." She nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement, her eyes full of a fragile hope. "I understand, Mark. I don't deserve any guarantees." For the first time, I saw a glimmer of the woman I'd married, the woman who'd stood by me through so much, who'd once been my best friend. She was still there, buried beneath the mistakes and the guilt. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough for now. The days passed slowly, marked by an unsteady routine that neither of us dared to disrupt. Lisa would go to work, return home, and spend most of her time quietly trying to piece together some semblance of normalcy. It was almost as if she was erasing any trace of Alex from our lives, scrubbing down every corner of the house, rearranging furniture, taking down the photos from the past few years and putting up new ones. She was trying to rebuild our life, to show me that she was here, present, committed. But for all her efforts, I still felt the gap between us, the emptiness that her betrayal had carved into my heart. And then, one evening, everything changed. I came home to find Lisa sitting on the couch, a small, worn envelope clutched in her hands. She looked up as I walked in, her face pale, her eyes wide with an emotion I couldn't quite read. "What is it?" I asked, feeling a strange, familiar dread coil in my gut. She held out the envelope, her hands shaking. It's from Alex." I froze, a chill running down my spine. "What do you mean, from Alex?" "He's dead." She nodded, her voice trembling. "He must have mailed it before he died. It came today, postmarked from the day before he was shot." I took the envelope from her, my hands feeling numb as I turned it over. My name was written on the front, in bold, slanted handwriting. I didn't recognize it, but the sight of it made my stomach twist. Slowly, I opened the envelope, pulling out a single sheet of paper, folded neatly in half. As I unfolded it, I felt Lisa's gaze on me, tense and waiting. I began to read. "Mark, if you're reading this, I'm probably gone. I didn't expect you to understand why Lisa and I ended up together, but you should know that I cared about her. Maybe that doesn't mean anything to you, but it's true. Lisa saw something in me, something that made me want to be better. I didn't deserve it, but she gave it to me anyway, and for that, I'll always be grateful. I know you'll hate me, and that's fine. You should. I'd probably hate me too if I were in your shoes. But before you write her off, just know this. She didn't do this to hurt you. She did it because she needed something you weren't giving her. Maybe that's not what you want to hear, but it's the truth. Take care of her, Mark. She's lost enough. Alex." I stared at the letter, my mind reeling, the words blurring before my eyes. It was as if he were still here, taunting me from beyond the grave, reminding me of what I'd lost, of what Lisa had taken from me. I felt Lisa's hand on my shoulder, tentative, like she wasn't sure if she had the right. "Mark," she whispered, her voice shaky. "I didn't know about the letter. I swear." I clenched my fists, my mind racing, my emotions a tangled mess of anger, hurt, and something else, something I couldn't quite name. Alex's words echoed in my mind, each one cutting deeper than the last. "He thinks he knew you," I said bitterly, folding the letter and setting it on the table. "He thinks he understood what you needed." She flinched, her face pale. "Mark, I don't know why I did what I did. I wish I could take it all back." I wanted to scream, to throw the letter, to make her see the pain she'd caused. But instead, I just looked at her, my heart aching with a sadness that felt like it would never leave. "Lisa," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "you destroyed us. You took something beautiful, something real, and you let him ruin it. And now, you expect me to just let that go?" She looked away, her eyes brimming with tears. "No," she whispered. "I don't expect that. But I can't live without you. Not after everything." For a long moment, we just sat there, the silence stretching between us, filled with the weight of everything we'd lost. I didn't know if I could ever forgive her, if I could ever look at her and not see him, not feel the sharp sting of betrayal. But as I looked into her eyes, I saw something fragile, something raw and broken. And for the first time, I wondered if maybe, just maybe, we could find a way through this. "I don't know if I can do this, Lisa," I said finally, my voice rough with emotion. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again." She nodded, her gaze unwavering. "I understand. And if that means I have to spend the rest of my life earning that trust, I will. I'll do whatever it takes, Mark. I don't want to lose you." I looked at her, the woman who'd been my wife, my partner, my best friend, and despite everything, despite the pain and the anger and the betrayal, I felt a faint flicker of hope. Maybe it wasn't enough to erase what had happened. Maybe it never would be. But for now, it was something. A small, fragile thread holding us together, keeping us from falling apart. "I don't know if we'll ever get back to where we were," I said quietly, "but I'm willing to try." She reached out, her hand brushing mine, and I let her. It was a tentative gesture, hesitant, full of the pain and regret we both carried. But it was real, and maybe in the end, that was all we had. The road ahead would be long, uncertain, and filled with scars that might never heal. But for the first time since that night, I felt a small spark of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Subscribe to the channel and like this story if you liked it. Turn on notifications so you don't miss new stories. Click on the playlist on the right to listen to previous stories. See you soon.